I am Elena, 32 years old. Exactly 3 days ago, my own parents tried to publicly strip me of my hard-earned home to give it to my unemployed brother. While I was standing there, holding a glass of vintage wine I had bought for them, my father literally took a microphone and said, "Our hardworking Elena is giving her penthouse to her brother." And when I said no, they didn't just laugh. My dad slapped me across the face in front of 30 people. But there is one thing they didn't know. The grandmother they thought was halfway across the country was actually 5 minutes away, with her lawyer, the real family inheritance in her hands, and a wrath they could never comprehend. And right now, my parents are begging me not to let them go homeless. Before I tell you exactly how it all went down, hit that like button if you believe in justice. And don't forget to let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's go back to where this nightmare began. The marble floor of my parents' grand foyer was freezing against my bare feet. I remember that specific detail so vividly because the creeping numbness in my toes was the only physical sensation keeping me anchored to reality. I had just walked out of the massive dining room, my left cheek burning like it had been pressed hard against an open flame. The sharp, explosive sound of that slap was still echoing in my ears. It rang louder than the expensive string quartet my parents had hired for the evening, louder than the clinking of crystal champagne flutes, louder than the collective gasp of 30 people who simply stood there and watched it happen. It was not just the physical sting of a grown man striking his daughter. It was the absolute, crushing realization that I had spent my entire adult life desperately trying to buy the love of people who only ever saw me as a walking ATM. I stood in that hallway, looking at my reflection in the gilded mirror hanging above the console table. My face was pale, except for the bright red handprint blossoming across my skin. My eyes were hard. That calmness scared me more than the violence, because it meant something deep inside me, a bond one had fiercely protected for 32 years, had just permanently snapped. For years, I truly believed that if I just worked a little harder, if I just achieved a little more, they would finally look at me the way they looked at my younger brother, Julian. And the absolute crown jewel of that portfolio was my penthouse in downtown Atlanta. It was a stunning piece of architecture. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering skyline, a massive wraparound terrace, a quiet, elevated sanctuary where I could finally breathe. It was the very first thing in my entire life that felt entirely mine, completely untouched by the toxic, demanding dynamics of the Carter family. It represented my independence, my late nights, my sacrifices. But in my family, my personal success was never celebrated as an individual achievement. It was always treated as a communal asset. Whenever I closed a massive commercial deal or secured a new promotion, my mother, Martha, would never say congratulations. She would never offer a hug. Instead, she would say something like, "That is nice, Elena. You know, Julian is really struggling with his rent this month. You have so much now, you really should help him out." It was always, constantly, relentlessly about Julian. He was the golden boy, the charming, charismatic. I had spent an entire decade funding their lavish lifestyle from the shadows. When the roof of my parents' sprawling McMansion needed a complete overhaul, I quietly paid the contractor. When they wanted to host extravagant Thanksgiving dinners to impress the HOA board and maintain their status in the neighborhood, I covered the expensive catering. When Julian crashed his car because he was driving recklessly, I was the one who quietly paid the insurance deductible so my parents wouldn't have to face a lawsuit. I thought I was being a dutiful daughter. I thought I was doing what loving families do. But you see, there is a massive, fundamental difference between taking care of your family and being financially abused by them. It took a public humiliation and a physical blow for me to finally understand the difference. The night of the party was officially supposed to be a simple birthday celebration for Julian. He was turning 28. I had spent the entire week leading up to it dreading the event, a heavy, nauseating knot of anxiety sitting right in the pit of my stomach. I knew how these gatherings went. They were never just parties, they were theatrical performances where everyone had a role to play, and my role was always the unappreciated bankroller. My best friend, Sarah, had explicitly warned me. She sat across from me at my kitchen island that very morning, watching me meticulously wrap a vintage Rolex I had bought for Julian. She took a slow sip of her coffee, looked me dead in the eye, and delivered a warning I chose to ignore. She told me I was walking into a trap. She said they did not want a watch, they wanted a sacrifice. I had brushed her off. I told her she was being overly dramatic. I told her that despite everything, despite the slights and the demands, they were still my family. I had this foolish, naive, deeply ingrained hope that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. I thought bringing an expensive gift would buy me a few hours of peace. But standing in that freezing hallway, rubbing the red welt on my face while 30 of their closest friends awkwardly shuffled their feet inside the dining room, I realized Sarah was entirely right. They had orchestrated this entire evening. The guest list, the timing, the public spectacle. It was a calculated ambush. I leaned my back against the cool glass of the floor-to-ceiling window in the corridor, looking out at the city lights twinkling in the distance. My penthouse was out there somewhere, a silent testament to my hard work. The very home they had just tried to steal from me with a round of applause and a forced smile. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out my phone. My hands were perfectly steady. I had never felt so terrifyingly calm in my entire life. I unlocked the screen, scrolled through my contacts, found the name, Eleanor, and pressed the call button. I didn't know it yet, but that single press of a glowing blue button was about to trigger the total, catastrophic collapse of my parents' carefully constructed empire of lies. I thought the worst was over. I checked my makeup in the rearview mirror, making sure my expression was carefully neutral. I plastered on my best, good daughter, smile, grabbed the heavy gift bag containing the Rolex, and stepped out into the humid evening air. The exact moment I stepped through the massive, custom oak double doors, the suffocating atmosphere of my childhood hit me like a physical wall. The house smelled like expensive lilies, roasted duck, and the heavy, overpowering floral perfume my mother always wore to these events. Martha was standing near the grand sweeping staircase, intensely fussing over a massive floral arrangement. She did not even bother to look up when the heavy door clicked shut behind me. "You are late," she said, her tone completely flat, devoid of even a fraction of maternal warmth. "Traffic was backed up on the interstate, Mom." "It is good to see you too," I replied, forcing myself to keep my voice light and pleasant. I walked over and handed her the bottle of wine I had carefully selected, a $200 vintage Cabernet I knew my father supposedly loved. She took the bottle without even glancing at the prestigious label and immediately handed it off to a passing caterer. "Just put it on the back bar with the cheap stuff. Julian's friends prefer tequila anyway." "You look absolutely exhausted, Elena. Are you still working yourself into the ground? You know, men do not like women who look like they carry the weight of the corporate world on their shoulders." I aggressively bit the inside of my cheek to stop myself from snapping back. "I run a highly successful company, Mom. The real estate market is demanding. It takes long hours." She finally turned to look at me, her eyes critical and sharp as they swept over my tailored, expensive suit. "It is unnatural. You should be focusing on settling down. Speaking of which, please try to be more accommodating tonight. Julian has been under immense pressure lately. The job market is just so unforgiving to him right now." The job market was not unforgiving. Julian simply refused to wake up before noon. He had quit 3 different entry-level positions in the past year because he claimed the managers did not respect his vision. But pointing out his chronic laziness was a cardinal sin in the Carter household. I nodded politely, swallowing the bitter taste of resentment, and made my way into the sprawling living room. The room was packed to the brim with the usual suspects. My parents' wealthy friends, Julian's former frat brothers who somehow never managed to grow up, and our judgmental extended family. It did not take long for the subtle, poison daggers to start flying in my direction. Aunt Beatrice spotted me from across the room and practically glided over, her eyes gleaming with that toxic, fake pity she absolutely loved to wear. "Elena, darling," she cooed loudly, kissing the air right next to my cheek so she wouldn't smudge her lipstick. "Look at you. Still so intensely sharp and businesslike. Tell me, has any brave soul managed to put a ring on that finger yet? Or are you still intimidating every single man in a 50-mile radius? Uncle Tom, her husband, stood right behind her holding a scotch. He offered a weak, entirely pathetic apologetic smile, but did not say a single word to defend me. He never did. He was the classic enabler, a man who preferred a quiet, coward's life over a just one. He knew how hard I worked, he knew how Julian leached off the family, but he would never dare upset the status quo. I am very focused on my career right now, Aunt Beatrice, I said, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my voice steady. I actually just closed a major commercial property deal downtown. She patted my arm with a deeply condescending smirk. That is nice, dear. But a fat 401k cannot keep you warm at night. Look at your brother Julian. He might not have all your little properties, but he is true love. Chloe is just an absolute angel. Right on cue, as if summoned by the mention of her name, Julian and Chloe made their grand entrance descending the stairs. Chloe was exactly everything my mother wanted me to be: docile, hyper-focused on her image, and completely, financially dependent on a man. She clung tightly to Julian's arm, laughing loudly at something he said, her designer bracelets clinking together. Julian looked exactly like my father did at his age, handsome, entitled, and entirely too confident for someone who had never paid his own phone bill in his entire life. I watched them work the room from afar. Julian was a master at the victim narrative. I stood near a marble pillar and overheard him telling one of my father's wealthy business associates about his latest tech startup idea that had tragically failed because his investors just did not possess the intellect to understand his grand vision. It was always someone else's fault, never his own lack of work ethic. I desperately needed air. I walked toward the glass patio doors, hoping to find a quiet corner on the terrace, but instead, I bumped directly into Mr. Sterling. He was one of my absolute biggest clients, the CEO of a massive tech firm I had recently helped relocate to a new headquarters. I was genuinely shocked to see him there. Elena, he beamed, reaching out and shaking my hand warmly. I had no idea you were Daniel's daughter. He invited me to talk about some potential manufacturing investments. I was just telling him how brilliantly you handled our downtown lease negotiations. You have a shark's instinct, but a true diplomat's touch. My board was incredibly impressed. Before I could even formulate a proper thank you, my father, Richard, materialized right beside us. His smile was wide and charismatic for Mr. Sterling, but his eyes were pure, freezing ice when they flicked to me. Well, she learned everything from the best, didn't she? Richard chuckled loudly, clapping Mr. Sterling hard on the shoulder. But let's not bore our honored guest with Elena's little real estate adventures. Come, Sterling, I want to show you my newly imported cigar humidor in the study. He smoothly and physically placed himself directly between me and my client, aggressively steering Mr. Sterling away before I could say another word. I stood there, completely humiliated. Little real estate adventures. My company had grossed over $3 million last year alone. I retreated to the bar in the corner, asking the bartender for a simple club soda with a lime. I desperately needed a clear head for whatever was coming next. As I sipped my cold drink, the memories flooded in, heavy and suffocating. The painful years of paying for Julian's exorbitant college tuition after he lost his academic scholarship because he simply refused to attend classes. The time I foolishly co-signed a luxury car loan for him, only for him to crash it while heavily intoxicated, leaving me to pay the massive insurance deductible and the remaining loan balance to avoid ruining my own pristine credit. Every single time, my parents had ruthlessly guilt-tripped me into bailing him out. Family takes care of family, Elena, they would constantly say. We're a team. You cannot leave your brother behind. But looking around this room, I realized with brutal clarity that I was the only one actually playing for the team. The rest of them were just sitting comfortably in the VIP section, demanding I continuously fetch them more drinks and pay the tab. I felt a sharp tap on my shoulder. It was Sarah, my fiercely loyal best friend. She was absolutely not invited to this event, but she knew my security code for the back gate and had quietly snuck in through the kitchen. "I explicitly told you not to come," I whispered, though a massive wave of relief washed over me at the sight of her familiar face. "And let you face this den of wolves entirely alone?" "Please," Sarah scoffed, grabbing a stuffed olive from the bar. "I give it 30 minutes tops before someone asks you to pay for Chloe's custom wedding dress. Have you noticed the bizarre vibe in here tonight? It is significantly weirder than usual. They're all looking at you like you are the main course at a Thanksgiving dinner." I scanned the crowded room. She was absolutely right. People were casting covert, whispering glances my way. Conversations abruptly stopped when I made direct eye contact. The air felt incredibly thick, charged with a highly uncomfortable, predatory anticipation. Suddenly, the hired string quartet abruptly stopped playing mid-song. My mother stepped proudly to the absolute center of the room, loudly tapping a silver spoon against a crystal champagne glass. The sharp, clear chime cut right through the low murmur of the wealthy crowd. "If everyone could please gather around," Martha announced loudly, her voice dripping with artificial, sugary sweetness. "Richard has a few very important words he wants to share with all of you before we cut the birthday cake." Sarah nudged me hard in the ribs. "Brace yourself. Here comes the shakedown." I took a deep, steadying breath, smoothing down the front of my expensive blazer. I genuinely thought I was fully prepared for whatever massive guilt trip or backhanded compliment they were about to throw my way. I thought I knew the absolute, rock-bottom depths of their emotional manipulation. But as my father confidently took the center stage, a microphone gripped tightly in his hand and a predatory, victorious gleam in his eye, I realized I was entirely unprepared for the sheer, catastrophic scale of the betrayal that was about to violently unfold. Just before he addressed the eagerly waiting crowd, Richard caught my eye from across the room. He gave a sharp, authoritative "Elena," he started, his back to me as he poured himself a generous measure of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. He did not offer me a drink. He didn't even offer me a seat. "We need to have a little family chat before the main event begins." "What is it, Dad?" I asked, keeping my distance, crossing my arms defensively over my chest. He slowly turned around and leaned casually against his massive, imposing desk, gently swirling the bourbon in his glass. "Julian is at a major crossroads in his life right now. He is getting married to a wonderful girl. He is going to be the official head of a household. And frankly, a man of his stature and potential cannot be renting a cramped, pathetic apartment in the suburbs. It is downright embarrassing for the Carter family name. So he should update his resume, get a real job, and buy a house like everyone else," I said evenly, keeping my tone perfectly level. "The real estate market is decent right now for first-time buyers. I can even recommend a highly rated mortgage broker to him." Richard's jaw tightened instantly, his charismatic facade slipping to reveal the controlling tyrant underneath. "Do not be insolent with me, Elena. You know perfectly well he does not have the credit history or the verified salary for a proper mortgage right now. But you have that massive penthouse downtown. The one you barely even use because you are always obsessively working." I stared at him, my brain genuinely struggling to process the sheer, unadulterated audacity of his words. "Are you seriously asking me to let Julian stay in my penthouse rent-free? I am not asking you anything. I am telling you that it is time to step up and do your duty," Richard said, his voice dropping into that low, dangerous, gravelly register he exclusively used when he demanded absolute submission. "We are going to announce tonight, in front of everyone, that you are transferring the official deed of the penthouse to Julian as a generous wedding gift. It is the right thing to do. You owe this family for the incredible foundation we gave you to succeed." My blood turned to absolute ice. The sheer entitlement made me physically nauseous. Transfer the deed? Are you completely insane? That property is worth over $2 million. I paid for it with my own blood, sweat, and money. You did not give me a foundation, Dad. You gave me a deep psychological complex and a mountain of therapy bills. The answer is absolutely, unequivocally no. He slammed his glass down on the desk and stepped closer, trying to physically intimidate me by towering over me. You listen to me right now, you ungrateful little. Before he could finish the threat, the heavy study door burst open. It was Chloe, looking breathless and glowing, with Julian standing right behind her grinning like an idiot. Richard, it's time. Chloe chirped loudly, completely ignoring the thick, suffocating tension radiating fiercely between my father and me. Richard's entire demeanor flipped in a microsecond. The angry monster vanished completely, instantly replaced by the loving, jovial patriarch. "We will be right out, dear," he said. He confidently walked out of the room, leaving me standing entirely alone in the dim study. My heart was hammering violently against my ribs like a trapped bird trying to escape. I took a long moment to deeply steady my breathing. I forcefully reminded myself that I was not a scared little girl anymore. I was a grown woman, a highly successful business owner who dealt with ruthless corporate sharks every single day. I smoothed my jacket, lifted my chin, and walked back out into the bright living room, strategically standing near the back wall right next to Sarah. Richard was already standing in the very center of the expansive room, confidently holding the microphone. The wealthy crowd was completely hushed, expectant, holding their drinks and waiting for the show. "Family and honored friends," Richard began, his voice booming effortlessly with forced joviality and practiced charm. "Tonight we gather to celebrate my son, Julian. But we also gather to celebrate the enduring power of family. In the Carter family, we firmly believe in unconditionally supporting each other. We believe that when one of us rises, we all rise together." A smattering of polite, enthusiastic applause broke out. I saw Aunt Beatrice nodding fervently, looking like a devoted cult member. "And tonight, we have some extra special news to share with all of you," Richard continued smoothly, gesturing grandly for Julian and Chloe to join him in the center. Chloe stepped forward, eagerly grabbing the microphone from him. She looked out at the massive crowd, her eyes shining with perfectly well-rehearsed tears. "Julian and I have been keeping a little, wonderful secret from you all. We did not want to steal the birthday spotlight, but we are pregnant." The entire room erupted in chaos. Gasps, loud cheers, thunderous applause. My mother, Martha, rushed forward with theatrical speed to pull Chloe into a massive, dramatic embrace, sobbing loudly for the cameras. Julian proudly pumped his fist in the air, looking like he had just conquered the world. I felt physically sick. My stomach churned. It was a trap. A brilliant, highly manipulative, emotional trap meticulously designed to corner me. Martha dramatically took the microphone, wiping away a fake, invisible tear from her perfectly powdered cheek. "A baby. A beautiful new generation for the Carter family. But of course, as we all know, a new baby desperately needs a proper, spacious home. A completely safe, secure, luxurious place to grow up. A place perhaps right in the vibrant heart of the city." She stopped speaking and looked directly, pointedly at me. The entire room, all 30 guests, followed her sharp gaze. 30 pairs of eyes turned in unison to lock directly onto me. Richard smoothly took the microphone back from his wife. He smiled a wide, predatory, shark-like smile that did not reach his cold eyes. Which is exactly why we are so incredibly proud to announce the ultimate, selfless act of sibling love tonight. Our extremely hardworking daughter, Elena, has generously decided that the absolute best place for her new nephew or niece to grow up is in her luxury downtown penthouse. She is officially gifting her beautiful home to Julian and Chloe. The crowd cheered even louder. Flashes from expensive phone cameras went off constantly. Someone in the back yelled, "That is incredibly amazing, Elena." Chloe dramatically covered her mouth in mock, theatrical shock, staring at me. "Oh my God, Elena, really? We couldn't possibly accept, but thank you so much." I stood completely frozen against the wall. I felt like the air had been violently sucked out of the room. I was suffocating. They had expertly cornered me in front of everyone I knew. They had weaponized an unborn child, a captive audience, and intense societal pressure to publicly mug me of my largest asset. They fully expected me to cave immediately to avoid making a messy public scene. They expected the decades of good daughter programming to automatically kick in. Suddenly, I felt a warm hand grip my arm. It was Marcus. We used to date several years ago, and now we frequently collaborated on massive commercial real estate deals. I had invited him tonight specifically to act as a professional buffer against my family. "Elena," Marcus whispered urgently, leaning his mouth close to my ear. "Just smile and nod. Agree to it for now. You are incredibly wealthy. You can easily afford to buy another place. Do not humiliate your powerful dad in front of Sterling and the other investors. It is terrible for business. Be the bigger person here." I slowly turned my head and looked at Marcus. I really, truly looked at him. This man, who intimately knew exactly how hard I worked, who knew exactly how deeply toxic and financially abusive my family was standing here telling me to surrender my $2 million home to appease a tyrannical bully. He was cowardly, choosing the path of least resistance. He was choosing proximity to my father's perceived power over basic loyalty to me. That was the exact, defining moment the illusion of my family shattered entirely into a million unfixable pieces. The lingering fear completely evaporated. The lifelong anxiety vanished into thin air. It was instantly replaced by a cold, crystalline, razor-sharp clarity. I looked at Marcus's cowardly face, then at my mother dramatically dabbing her dry eyes, then at Julian looking incredibly smug and entitled, and finally at my father, who was standing there holding his empty hand out toward me, fully expecting me to obediently walk into the center of the ring and accept my total defeat. I did not move a single inch toward him. I calmly handed my glass of club soda to Sarah, who was staring at the scene in pure horror. I looked directly at the wealthy crowd, the sea of expectant faces, the people who were eagerly, hungrily waiting to witness my complete subjugation. I took a deep, fortifying breath, filling my lungs with air, preparing to violently tear down the fake facade they had spent decades building. I was about to detonate a bomb in the middle of their perfect party. No, the word was not a loud scream. It was not hysterical or shaking with tears. It was spoken at a completely normal, even conversational volume, but in that silent, highly expectant room, it cracked through the air like a literal gunshot. The enthusiastic applause died instantly. The beaming smiles froze awkwardly on the guests' faces. Aunt Beatrice's jaw literally dropped open, her wine glass halting halfway to her mouth. Richard's outstretched hand forcefully twitched. He let out a highly awkward, deeply forced chuckle directly into the microphone. "Elena, darling, this is absolutely not the time for your little jokes. Come up here and give your brother a hug." I did not smile. I took one deliberate, confident step forward, separating myself from the wall. "I am not joking, Richard. I am absolutely not giving my home to Julian. I am not transferring any deed, not today, not ever. That penthouse is mine. I worked for it, I bought it, I paid for it, and I am keeping it." A collective, audible gasp sharply echoed through the expansive room. The silence that immediately followed was so thick and heavy it was physically suffocating. Martha lunged forward, abandoning her perfectly poised posture. Her voice was a harsh, frantic, venomous whisper that carried perfectly in the dead quiet of the room. "Elena, stop this nonsense right now. You are completely humiliating us in front of everyone. Think of the innocent baby. You are actively using an unborn child to illegally extort a $2 million property from me in public, Mom," I replied smoothly, my voice remarkably steady, projecting loudly so every single guest could hear the undeniable truth. If Julian desperately needs a house for his new family, he can finally get a real job and apply for a mortgage. I have single-handedly funded this family's lavish lifestyle for the last 10 solid years. I paid for the very catering at this party. I paid for the roof over your head. But I am drawing the absolute, final line at my home. Julian's face turned a violent, splotchy shade of bright red. His charming mask slipped entirely. "You selfish, greedy witch," he spat loudly, stepping aggressively toward me. "You have so much damn money. You do not even need that much space. You are just going to die miserable and alone in it anyway, because no man can stand you." I did not even bother to look at him. He was a pathetic parasite beneath my notice. I kept my eyes entirely, fiercely fixed on my father. Richard's face was a terrifying mask of pure, unadulterated, explosive rage. The thick veins in his neck and forehead were visibly bulging. He aggressively dropped the heavy microphone onto the marble floor. The sharp, piercing squeal of audio feedback made several wealthy guests physically. He marched directly toward me, closing the distance between us in 3 long, furious strides. Before my brain could fully process his violent movement, before Sarah could reach out and pull me back out of harm's way, his large hand flew rapidly through the air. Crack! The physical impact violently snapped my head sharply to the side. The sheer, brutal force of the blow was so intense it completely knocked me off balance. I stumbled backward, my shoulder slamming hard into the sharp edge of a heavy oak side table. A sudden, blinding, sharp pain violently bloomed across my entire left cheek, feeling intensely hot and stinging. I heard the delicate, distinct tink-tink-tink of my expensive pearl earring bouncing rapidly across the polished marble floor, rolling away under a chair. Someone in the crowd screamed loudly. I think it was Chloe, finally realizing the horrifying reality of the family she was marrying into. But absolutely no one stepped in to help me. Uncle Tom actively looked down at the floor, too cowardly to intervene. "Marcus." I slowly, deliberately turned my head back to face my father. He stood there looming over me, his broad chest heaving heavily, his large hand still hovering menacingly in the air between us. He was intensely waiting for me to break. He was aggressively waiting for the tears, the desperate apology, the total, humiliating submission he had successfully demanded his entire life. I felt the distinct metallic taste of warm blood inside my mouth where my teeth had cut into my cheek. I slowly reached up, my trembling fingers gently brushing the burning, swollen skin. Then, I slowly bent down, maintaining my dignity, and calmly picked up the pearl earring from the cold floor. I stood up perfectly tall, carefully straightening the lapels of my expensive jacket. I looked him dead in the eye, my gaze completely hollow and cold. "Happy birthday, Julian," I said, my voice completely, terrifyingly devoid of any human emotion. I turned sharply on my heel and walked out. I did not run crying. I did not rush in panic. I walked out with the measured, highly deliberate, powerful steps of a woman who had just been violently set free from a lifelong prison. The heavy oak double doors closed shut solidly behind me, instantly cutting off the sudden, chaotic explosion of panicked, urgent whispers inside the house. The cool night air hit my burning face like a refreshing splash of ice water. I walked briskly down the long driveway, my heels clicking sharply and rhythmically on the dark pavement. Sarah was right behind me, matching my pace. "Oh my absolute God, Elena," Sarah gasped breathlessly, gently grabbing my arm. "Let me see your face right now. We are calling the police this second. That is straight-up assault." "No," I said firmly, pulling my phone from my pocket with completely steady hands. "The local police will just give him a minor misdemeanor, and he will buy his way out of it. I want to entirely, systematically destroy him." I dialed the secure number. It rang exactly twice before a crisp, sharp, incredibly authoritative voice answered the line. "Eleanor speaking." "Grandma," I said, my voice finally trembling just a microscopic fraction as I spoke to the only person who truly protected me. "It's Elena. They did it. Exactly like you predicted they would." There was a heavy, pregnant pause on the other end of the secure line. Then, my grandmother's voice came through, colder and more ruthless than the thick ice in a winter storm. "Did that pathetic excuse for a man touch you?" "Yes. I am exactly 5 minutes away. Wait by the front gate. Do not let a single person leave that property." I hung up the phone. I stood silently by the massive wrought iron gates of the sprawling estate, the cool night breeze slowly soothing the intense fire radiating from my bruised cheek. Inside the massive house, I could hear the faint, pathetic sound of the string quartet frantically starting up again, a deeply desperate, pathetic attempt by my mother to pretend everything was perfectly normal, to sweep the horrifying violence under the expensive rug exactly like they always did. But this massive transgression was absolutely not going to be swept under the rug. Not tonight. Exactly 5 minutes later, the massive iron security gates slowly swung open with a heavy mechanical groan. Bright LED headlights cut sharply through the surrounding darkness. A sleek, pristine, midnight black Rolls-Royce glided silently up the driveway, its heavy tires crunching softly and menacingly against the expensive gravel. The massive luxury vehicle came to a smooth, complete stop right in front of the main entrance. The personal driver quickly stepped out and respectfully opened the heavy rear door. I watched in intense anticipation as a pair of expensive silver-tipped walking canes touched the pavement. The true matriarch of the Carter family had arrived, and she was bringing absolute hell with her. The massive iron security gates of my parents' estate had barely finished their slow, mechanical groan before the pristine, midnight black Rolls-Royce came to a completely silent stop right in front of the grand entrance. The heavy, humid Atlanta night air suddenly felt electrically charged. I stood there on the expansive gravel driveway, a grown man of 32, yet my heart was pounding against my ribs with the intense, chaotic rhythm of a terrified child. My left cheek was still radiating a sharp, stinging heat from where my father had brutally struck me. I gently touched my jaw, feeling the slight swelling beneath my skin. As a man who had spent his entire adult life building a professional empire, the sheer physical humiliation of being slapped in front of 30 people was a deeply unique kind of psychological trauma. But that trauma was about to be weaponized into absolute justice. The driver, a tall, imposing man in a perfectly tailored dark suit, stepped out of the luxury vehicle and smoothly opened the heavy rear door. I watched in intense, silent anticipation as a pair of expensive, silver-tipped walking canes touched the dark pavement. Then, Eleanor Carter emerged. My grandmother was 78 years old, but she possessed the terrifying, commanding aura of a seasoned military general. She wore a sharp, charcoal gray tailored suit, her silver hair styled impeccably, her posture completely straight despite the canes she used for balance. Following closely behind her was Mr. Vance, her personal lawyer, a man who looked like he ate corporate contracts for breakfast. He carried a thick, heavy leather briefcase that I instinctively knew held the absolute destruction of my father's entire world. Eleanor slowly turned her sharp, piercing blue eyes toward me. She did not immediately ask how I was feeling. She did not offer a soft, maternal hug. She simply looked at my face, her gaze locking onto the bright red, hand-shaped welt blooming across my skin. The temperature in the driveway seemed to drop 10 degrees in a single second. Her jaw tightened, a microscopic movement that spoke volumes of her boiling rage. "Elias," she said, her voice completely calm, smooth, and terrifyingly cold. "I have spent 50 years building the Carter family inheritance. I built a legacy of respect, of power, of unyielding dignity. And I did not build it so that a pathetic, deeply insecure man could physically strike my grandson over a piece of real estate. He thinks he has already won, Grandma," I replied, my voice remarkably steady now that she was standing beside me. "He thinks because he had an audience, because he used Julian's new baby as a public weapon, that I will eventually cave and hand over my penthouse. He thinks he is the absolute king of this family." Eleanor let out a short, humorless scoff that sounded like a blade sliding against a whetstone. "A king does not need to beg for his son's salary to keep his kingdom afloat. A king does not steal from his own blood. Walk with me, Elias. It is time to aggressively remind your father who actually owns the castle." We began the slow, deliberate walk toward the massive oak double doors. Every single step Eleanor took was punctuated by the sharp, authoritative click of her silver-tipped canes against the stone steps. "Sarah," My fiercely loyal best friend, who had witnessed the entire horrifying ordeal, walked silently a few paces behind us, acting as my personal witness to the impending storm. Inside the house, the atmosphere was completely bizarre. As I pushed the heavy doors open for my grandmother, the lively, chaotic sounds of the party spilled out into the foyer. The string quartet was frantically playing a cheerful Mozart piece, a deeply desperate, pathetic attempt by my mother to pretend that a violent assault had not just occurred in her living room. The wealthy guests were awkwardly mingling, holding their expensive champagne flutes, casting nervous, sidelong glances toward the hallway. They were trapped in the highly uncomfortable position of having witnessed a family implosion, but lacking the basic moral courage to simply leave. The exact moment Eleanor's cane struck the polished marble floor of the grand foyer, the entire house seemed to freeze. The cellist actually fumbled his bow, creating a sharp, discordant screech that echoed loudly off the high ceilings. The music stopped instantly. Conversations died mid-sentence. 30 pairs of eyes snapped toward the entrance. Richard was standing near the massive stone fireplace, holding a fresh glass of expensive bourbon, looking incredibly smug and victorious. He had a wide, arrogant smile plastered across his face, actively chatting with Mr. Sterling as if he had just successfully closed the biggest business deal of his life instead of publicly assaulting his own son. But when he saw Eleanor standing in the doorway, surrounded by me and her ruthless lawyer, the arrogant smile violently slipped from his face. For a fraction of a second, I saw raw, unfiltered panic flash in his eyes. But Richard was a master manipulator. He quickly recovered, his ego violently overriding his basic common sense. He genuinely believed that because Eleanor was the matriarch, she would naturally side with him, the head of the household, especially regarding the family legacy and the arrival of a new heir. He enthusiastically set his glass down and marched across the room, spreading his arms wide in a grand, theatrical gesture of welcome. "Mother!" Richard boomed loudly, his voice echoing in the dead silent room. "What an absolutely incredible surprise! We had no idea you were flying in from the coast. You are just in time for the most amazing family news. Julian is going to be a father." Martha quickly rushed over, her high heels clicking rapidly against the marble. She plastered on a fake, overly bright smile, reaching out to touch Eleanor's arm. "Oh, Eleanor, it is a true blessing. A new generation for the Carter family. We were just trying to arrange a proper, stable living situation for the baby. You know how important a good home is. We are so thrilled you are here to celebrate with us." Eleanor did not move. She did not smile. She simply stared down at Martha's hand resting on her sleeve until Martha, visibly deeply uncomfortable, slowly pulled her hand back as if she had just touched a hot stove. The silence in the room stretched on, becoming thick, heavy, and intensely suffocating. The wealthy guests were completely motionless, realizing they were suddenly trapped in the front row of an execution. Richard awkwardly cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the narrative. He shot me a dark, condescending look before turning back to his mother. "Mother, I apologize for the slight tension in the room. Elias here is just throwing a bit of a childish tantrum. We asked him, very politely, to step up and support his brother by transferring the deed to his downtown real estate. A simple wedding gift. But you know how selfish this generation can be. He actually tried to embarrass us in front of our honored guests. I simply had to step in and restore order." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of his words made my blood boil. He was completely trapped in the blinding snare of his own complacency. He genuinely thought that phrasing it as restoring order would appeal to Eleanor's strict sense of traditional family values. He thought she would look at me, the successful but fiercely independent grandson, and command me to fall into line. He thought his authority was absolute. "Restore order," Eleanor repeated slowly, her voice completely flat, testing the weight of the words on her tongue. "You assaulted your own son. You struck a grown man across the face in front of 30 witnesses because he boldly refused to surrender a $2 million property that he purchased with his own hard-earned salary. And you call that restoring order? Richard's face flushed a deep, angry red. He puffed out his chest, leaning slightly forward. Mother, this is family business. Elias has been entirely ungrateful. He hoards his wealth while his brother struggles. I am the head of this family, and I have made a final decision regarding the distribution of assets. He needs to learn respect. You are the head of nothing, Richard, Eleanor snapped, her voice finally cracking like a violent whip, slicing through his massive ego. You are a deeply pathetic, small man masquerading as a titan. You demand respect while demonstrating none. You demand absolute obedience while possessing absolutely zero moral authority. And you dare to speak to me about the distribution of assets? She turned slightly, gesturing for Lawyer Vance to step forward. The lawyer calmly unlatched the heavy brass locks on his leather briefcase. The sharp, metallic clicks echoed loudly in the silent room. Julian, who had been hiding cowardly near the dessert table with Chloe, finally spoke up, his voice trembling slightly. Grandma, it's for the baby. Elias doesn't need that massive penthouse. We just wanted a safe place to raise your great-grandchild. Dad was just trying to help us secure our future. Don't let Elias ruin this night for us. Eleanor slowly turned her terrifying gaze toward Julian. The golden child physically shrank under her scrutiny. Your future, Julian, is entirely your own responsibility. You are 28 years old. You have never held a steady job. You blew through a massive college fund that I personally established for you, and now you are attempting to publicly extort your brother. You are not a victim. You are a highly privileged parasite. Chloe loudly gasped, covering her mouth in theatrical shock. Martha let out a high-pitched wail. Eleanor, how can you say such horrible things about your own flesh and blood? They're expecting a child. And what a terrifying tragedy it is that this child will be raised by two deeply incompetent adults who believe the world owes them a free ride, Eleanor replied coldly. She turned her attention entirely back to Richard, who was now visibly sweating, his charismatic mask completely destroyed. The trap of his own complacency had finally snapped shut around his neck. He had invited all these people to witness his absolute power, and now they were about to witness his total, humiliating annihilation. You wanted an audience tonight, Richard, Eleanor said, her voice dropping into a low, lethal register that sent shivers down my spine. You wanted to publicly display your dominance. You wanted to humiliate Elias into total submission. Well, you have your audience. But the show is going to have a very different ending than the one you brilliantly directed. Eleanor firmly planted both of her silver-tipped canes onto the polished marble floor and leaned slightly forward, her eyes locked intensely on Richard. The tension in the expansive room was so incredibly thick it felt like trying to breathe underwater. Every single guest was entirely frozen, some of them subtly inching their expensive phones out of their pockets, realizing they were witnessing the epic, total destruction. Before we discuss anything regarding real estate or the family inheritance, Eleanor commanded, her voice cutting through the heavy air, I want you to look at your son's face, Richard. I want you to look at the bright red mark you violently left on his skin. Richard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. He refused to look at me. He kept his eyes fiercely glued to his mother, a desperate, pathetic attempt to maintain his crumbling authority. Mother, I told you, he was being totally disrespectful in front of Mr. Sterling and the other investors. I simply lost my temper for a brief second. It was a minor incident. A minor incident, Eleanor repeated, her tone dripping with venomous sarcasm. You think physically assaulting a grown man is a minor incident? Very well. Let us talk about respect. When a man violently strikes another person and knocks something to the ground, a true gentleman immediately kneels to pick it up. I understand you knocked Elias's pearl earring across the floor. Martha frantically stepped forward, her hands fluttering nervously. Eleanor, please, this is utterly ridiculous. He is the patriarch of this family. You cannot seriously expect him to. I expect him to get on his hands and knees exactly like the pathetic coward he is, Eleanor roared, her voice suddenly booming with terrifying, absolute authority. She slammed her cane hard against the floor. The loud crack made several guests physically jump. "You have exactly 5 minutes, Richard. You and your deeply spoiled golden child, Julian. Get on the floor and find that earring. Now." The entire room gasped in total, unadulterated shock. Julian's face went entirely pale. He looked at his father, expecting Richard to fiercely fight back, to assert his dominance. But Richard was completely trapped. He intimately knew that Eleanor held the absolute, sole power over the massive family trust fund. He knew that defying her in this specific moment meant losing every single penny he desperately relied upon. Slowly, agonizingly, with his face burning a bright, humiliating shade of purple, Richard Carter, the arrogant, tyrannical businessman, slowly sank to his knees in his expensive custom-tailored suit. Julian, seeing his invincible father completely break, instantly followed suit, dropping to the floor. The two men began to awkwardly, humiliatingly crawl across the polished marble floor, sweeping their hands under heavy chairs and ornate tables, desperately searching for a tiny pearl earring in front of 30 silent, judging witnesses. I stood there, watching my abusers reduced to literal crawling. I slowly reached into my jacket pocket, feeling the smooth, cool surface of the pearl earring securely resting there. I had picked it up before I walked out. Eleanor absolutely knew I had it. This was not about recovering a piece of jewelry. This was about completely breaking their massive, fragile egos. This was about public subjugation. While they are busy thoroughly inspecting the floorboards, Eleanor said casually, turning her attention to the captive audience of wealthy guests, "I think it is the perfect time to publicly clarify a few massive misconceptions regarding the Carter family legacy. My son, Richard, has spent the last decade portraying himself as a highly successful, brilliant titan of industry. She gestured sharply to Lawyer Vance. The lawyer pulled a thick stack of aggressively highlighted legal documents from his heavy briefcase and calmly handed them to her. "The absolute truth," Eleanor continued, her voice projecting clearly to every corner of the room, "is that Richard's manufacturing company has been functionally, entirely bankrupt for the last 3 solid years." A loud, collective gasp violently rippled through the wealthy crowd. Mr. Sterling, my most important client, aggressively narrowed his eyes, clearly realizing he had almost been scammed into a massive, terrible investment. Martha let out a quiet, terrified whimper, pressing her hands tightly over her mouth. The men on the floor abruptly stopped crawling, freezing exactly where they were. "That is a complete lie," Richard suddenly shouted from the floor, trying desperately to scramble back to his feet. "Mother, you cannot just announce confidential financial information. Stay exactly on the floor," Eleanor barked fiercely. Richard instantly froze again, hovering awkwardly on his knees. Eleanor held up the thick legal documents for the entire crowd to see. "These are the official, certified court filings. Richard's company is currently facing a massive, multi-million-dollar corporate lawsuit for gross negligence and severe breach of contract. The massive promotion he has been heavily bragging about at the country club was actually him." The total silence in the room was deafening. The carefully constructed, highly polished facade of the perfect, wealthy Carter family was violently disintegrating into dust right before my eyes. But how have they been actively affording this incredibly lavish lifestyle? Aunt Beatrice suddenly blurted out from the crowd, her insatiable, toxic curiosity completely overriding her basic social manners. "The country club memberships? This massive, multi-million-dollar estate? Julian's constant, expensive European vacations?" Eleanor turned her sharp gaze directly toward me. A distinct look of profound, genuine respect briefly flashed in her cold eyes. "That is the most sickening part of this entire tragedy. They have been aggressively funding their massive delusion of wealth through the intense, relentless financial abuse of the only truly successful person in this family, Elias." Every single eye in the massive room slowly turned to me. "Elias has single-handedly paid the massive property taxes on this estate for the last 5 years, Eleanor revealed, her voice filled with deep, heavy disgust. When Julian completely blew through his massive college fund gambling and partying, Richard secretly drained his own retirement accounts to cover the massive debts, and then relentlessly guilt-tripped Elias into paying for Julian's basic living expenses out of his own hard-earned corporate salary. The massive luxury cars sitting in the driveway? Deeply leased, and Elias has been quietly covering the massive monthly premiums just to keep the aggressive repo men away. I felt a massive, heavy weight suddenly lift entirely off my shoulders. For my entire adult life, I had been forced to suffer in total, agonizing silence, constantly painted as the cold, entirely ungrateful son while I quietly bled myself dry to desperately keep my family afloat. Now the absolute, undeniable truth was completely exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light. And tonight, Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a deadly, serious whisper, tonight, when Elias finally, bravely established a firm boundary and refused to actively hand over a $2 million penthouse to a profoundly lazy, entitled parasite, Richard chose to violently assault him. He chose violence over basic gratitude. Richard finally stood up from the floor, his expensive suit wrinkled, his face a mask of absolute, raw desperation. He was completely out of options. Mother, please. We were just trying to survive. We did not want to lose the massive family legacy. We did not want to lose the estate. You already lost it the exact second you raised your hand against my grandson, Eleanor stated coldly. She turned entirely to Lawyer Vance. Vance, please publicly confirm the strict execution of the new documents. Mr. Vance stepped forward, adjusting his glasses. As of 8 o'clock this evening, Mrs. Eleanor Carter has officially, legally rewritten her entire estate planning. Richard Carter has been completely, permanently excised from the massive family trust. The massive inheritance, the vast corporate holdings, and the extensive global real estate portfolio have been entirely, irrevocably transferred. Elias Carter is now the sole, exclusive beneficiary and immediate executor of the entire Carter estate. The total shock that violently rippled through the massive room was akin to a literal physical shockwave. Martha screamed loudly, a piercing, hysterical sound of pure, unadulterated financial terror. Julian completely froze on the floor, staring blankly at the marble as if his brain had entirely short-circuited. Chloe, the gold-digging fiancée, aggressively dropped her hands from her stomach, her fake smile completely vanishing into a look of raw, calculating panic. You cannot legally do this. Richard barked wildly, stepping aggressively toward the lawyer. I am your only living son. You cannot just give the entire empire to him. I will aggressively fight this in court. I will launch a massive lawsuit. You literally do not have the financial resources to hire a cheap paralegal, let alone afford a massive lawsuit against my corporate firm, Vance replied completely smoothly, utterly unfazed by the pathetic threat. The legal paperwork is entirely ironclad. You own absolutely nothing. Eleanor turned to me. Do you happen to have the pearl earring, Elias? I nodded slowly, reached into my pocket, and calmly pulled out the tiny, glowing pearl. I walked slowly to the absolute center of the room, feeling the intense gaze of 30 shocked people burning into my back. I gently, deliberately placed the pearl earring right on the edge of the large marble table. The tiny click sounded like a massive gavel dropping in a silent courtroom. There it is, I said quietly, my voice perfectly steady. I looked directly at my father. He looked entirely destroyed. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire universe aggressively implode. You desperately wanted total obedience today. You violently demanded a massive sacrifice. Instead, you get nothing but my total silence. I genuinely hope the profound emptiness of your fake life echoes forever. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far, you're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below, so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover the story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. The immediate, chaotic aftermath of Eleanor's massive revelation was like watching a violently sinking ship where all the wealthy rats were aggressively scrambling for the nearest exit. The highly extravagant birthday party instantly transformed into a deeply humiliating mass exodus. Guests began rapidly scattering toward the heavy front doors, frantically murmuring incredibly awkward, rushed apologies and completely transparent excuses about sudden emergencies. Nobody wanted to be closely associated with a completely bankrupt, publicly disgraced, physically abusive family. Mr. Sterling, the highly influential tech CEO, did not even bother looking at my father as he briskly walked out. He completely ignored Richard's desperate, pathetic attempts to grab his arm and heavily apologize. Instead, Sterling stopped right in front of me, firmly extended his hand, and gave me a deeply respectful, solid handshake. "Elias, I profoundly respect how you handled yourself tonight. Your extreme professionalism under such intense, violent pressure is incredibly rare. We will absolutely be continuing our massive real estate contracts exclusively with your corporate firm. Expect a call from my executive team on Monday." As Sterling walked out the door, Marcus, my former colleague who had cowardly advised me to simply surrender my home to appease my abuser, frantically jogged up to me. He was visibly sweating, a nervous, deeply fake smile plastered across his pale face. "Elias, man, listen. I am so incredibly sorry. I had absolutely no idea your dad was entirely broke or that he would get violent. You know I always entirely have your back, right? We are still good for the massive downtown commercial deal next week, right?" I stared at him, feeling absolutely nothing but pure, unadulterated disgust. "We are entirely done, Marcus. Do not ever contact my corporate firm again." Lawyer Vance, standing right behind me, smoothly stepped forward, physically blocking Marcus from approaching me further, silently ensuring the pathetic coward backed away and quickly scuttled out the door into the night. Inside the massive, rapidly emptying living room, the absolute reality of their total financial ruin was finally, brutally sinking in for my family. Martha was completely hysterical. She aggressively grabbed Richard by the expensive lapels of his suit, her face completely contorted in raw fury. "You entirely lied to me," she screamed at the top of her lungs, completely abandoning her carefully cultivated, highly elegant country club persona. "You explicitly told me the massive corporate lawsuit was entirely handled. You told me the family inheritance was completely secure. I cannot live like a pathetic, broke peasant, Richard. I am calling a highly aggressive divorce lawyer the absolute second the sun comes up. I am taking half of whatever pathetic scraps you have left." "Half of absolutely zero is zero, Martha," Richard roared back, his face bright purple, his voice cracking violently with total desperation. He aggressively shoved her hands away. "We are deeply, heavily mortgaged to the absolute hilt. The entire estate is going directly into immediate foreclosure by next month if Elias stops making the massive payments." While they violently screamed at each other, I slowly turned my attention to Julian. He was still sitting pathetically on the marble floor, staring blankly into empty space. Chloe, his supposedly loving, devoted fiancée, was frantically, aggressively stuffing her expensive designer belongings into her massive Birkin bag. "Chloe, what are you actively doing?" Julian asked weakly, finally registering her frantic, aggressive movements. "We need to deeply figure this out." "The baby?" Chloe abruptly stopped, letting out a sharp, incredibly cruel, highly mocking laugh. She looked down at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Are you completely, utterly stupid, Julian? There is absolutely no baby. I entirely faked the pregnancy to aggressively pressure your wealthy family into quickly giving us that massive $2 million penthouse before you inevitably blew the massive wedding budget. I am absolutely not staying legally tied to a completely broke, deeply lazy loser. At least I don't have to deal with a messy, expensive custody battle now. Have a nice, pathetic life in the suburbs." She aggressively hoisted her heavy designer bag over her shoulder and quickly marched out the front door without looking back once, leaving Julian completely shattered on the floor, weeping loudly and pathetically. The golden child was finally entirely alone, entirely stripped of his massive financial armor. Eleanor slowly tapped her silver cane against the floor. "We are entirely done here, Elias. Let us leave them to thoroughly rot in the massive, toxic mess they actively created." I nodded slowly, feeling a deep, profound sense of intense, heavy closure. I turned my back on the violent screaming, the pathetic crying, and the complete, total destruction of my abusers, and walked out into the cool, refreshing night air with my grandmother. By the very next morning, the total destruction was absolutely complete. My cousin Lily, who had been quietly hiding in the corner during the massive confrontation, had covertly recorded the entire, explosive incident on her phone from multiple angles. She uploaded the highly dramatic footage to the internet, and it went massively, globally viral within hours. The explosive video spread rapidly across every single major social media platform with aggressive, viral captions like, "Wealthy, arrogant father violently slaps successful son over penthouse. Grandma arrives in Rolls Royce and instantly destroys entire family empire." The massive public fallout was incredibly brutal and entirely swift. Reporters aggressively camped outside my parents' rapidly foreclosing estate by noon. My father's remaining wealthy business partners immediately, publicly withdrew from all pending corporate deals. My mother's highly prestigious charity board quietly, firmly asked her to permanently step down to entirely avoid the massive PR nightmare. I did not release a public statement. I did not need to. The entire world was actively, loudly saying everything for me. Justice had not just been served, it had been deeply, permanently scorched into the earth. 3 days have passed since the explosive nightmare at the estate. I am currently sitting alone in my expansive downtown penthouse. The warm, golden morning light is stretching beautifully across the gleaming hardwood floors, illuminating the vast, quiet space. I am holding a hot cup of black coffee, watching the bustling city slowly wake up far below my massive floor-to-ceiling windows. For the first time in my entire 32 years of existence, the silence in my life does not feel like a deeply painful, isolating punishment. It feels like profound, absolute peace. My phone briefly buzzed on the kitchen island. I slowly picked it up and saw a massive block of text from Julian. Despite everything, despite the total public exposure and the complete financial ruin, he was still aggressively trying to manipulate the situation. "Elias, please," the desperate text read. "Mom and Dad are actively, violently fighting nonstop. The bank sent a formal foreclosure notice this morning. Chloe completely left me and entirely blocked my number. I have absolutely nowhere to go. I am your younger brother. You have massive amounts of money and properties now. You cannot just legally let me end up homeless on the street. Please let me temporarily stay in the guest room of the penthouse. Just until I get back on my feet. Family is family." I stared intently at the glowing screen for a long, quiet moment. A year ago, reading those desperate words would have instantly triggered a massive, intense wave of deeply ingrained guilt. I would have frantically rushed to legally bail him out, deeply terrified of being permanently labeled the bad son or the unforgiving brother. I would have quietly written a massive check, violently sacrificing my own mental health to maintain the deeply toxic illusion of our family bond. But I am no longer that terrified, deeply manipulated man. The violent slap my father delivered had forcefully shattered the final, lingering illusion. I had finally realized that giving them my massive resources was not actually helping them, it was simply funding my own continuous abuse. I calmly opened the settings on my phone, selected Julian's contact profile, and firmly, decisively pressed block. I did the exact same profound thing for my mother, my father, and every single toxic, enabling relative who had cowardly stood silently by and watched me get violently assaulted. I permanently severed the deep, poisonous roots. I set the phone down and took a deep, refreshing breath of the quiet air. People often heavily. My grandmother Eleanor had legally transferred the massive family empire into my name, not merely as a financial reward, but as a deep, profound validation of my character. I am actively using the vast inheritance to heavily expand my corporate real estate firm, strictly prioritizing ethical housing investments and heavily funding massive educational scholarships for independent young adults who actively choose to break free from deeply abusive, toxic family dynamics. I am completely transforming the dark, poisoned Carter legacy into something deeply positive, powerful, and truly meaningful. I gently touched my left cheek. The red mark has entirely faded away, leaving absolutely no physical trace. The deep, internal wounds will naturally take significantly longer to fully heal, but for the very first time in my life, I am absolutely no longer actively bleeding. I am entirely safe in my own castle, a massive fortress I meticulously built with my own hands, completely free from their toxic control. As I stand here looking out over the beautiful city, I want to say something directly to anyone watching this who is currently trapped in a similar nightmare. If you are deeply exhausting yourself constantly trying to earn the love of family members who only deeply value you for what you can financially or emotionally provide them, please firmly stop. You absolutely cannot buy genuine respect, and you absolutely cannot fix people who are fundamentally committed to profoundly misunderstanding you. Walking away from incredibly toxic family members does not automatically make you a bad person. It makes you a profoundly strong survivor. Protect your intense peace, firmly establish your boundaries, and never, ever apologize for actively refusing to be someone else's collateral damage. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you ever had to make the deeply painful but absolutely necessary decision to walk away from the people who were supposed to unconditionally love you? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey. Thank you for listening.